Hello everyone, and welcome finally to part 2, Growth of the Market Revolution. Sorry this taken so long, and since it's taken so long, I'm just going to get right into it. We'll have the first slide. Thank you very much. Now, one of the things you must remember that's taking place is this westward migration. We've talked a lot about it in the Northeast. People are migrating into Ohio, to Indiana, what will become the Michigan Territory, Wisconsin. Also, we talked about in the South. Eventually, Mississippi, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are eventually going to become states. The number of farmers in the country is also increasing. And with the number of increasing farmers, they're wanting to sell their product more and more toward the West. They want to go west as markets are being created out there. So we're going to need transportation. What many individuals at the time period refer to as internal improvements. One of the first internal improvements obviously would be roads. In 1792, the very first such road is the Lancaster Turnpike. Now it's only 65 miles and it only stretched from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. But it's the first time they tried to create an actual road that can get people from one place to the other. One of the more popular roads, or one of the longest roads of its time period, is the National Road, sometimes also referred to as the Cumberland Road. It began in 1811 and it finishes its construction in 1818. Now this stretched 591 miles, and this is going to go through several states. It's going to finally connect the Potomac River to the Ohio River, and it's the only road of its time period that Congress, under Republican control, remember this is during the time period where Republicans are strict constructionists, and they do not believe that federal money should be used to build roads and canals. But Congress will give some money towards this. Although in 1822, then President James Monroe will veto a bill from Congress that tried to set aside money to improve and to extend the Cumberland Road. His big problem, again being a strict constructionist Republican, is he feels that an amendment must be added to the Constitution before any more money is taken from federal funds to give to state roads. But again, roads are very important. It's going to increase travel. It's going to start bringing markets from the east to the west. And this is going to add to the growth of the United States. Another very important development is technology. In 1807, Robert Fulton unleashes what he calls his steamboat, the Clermont. Now, this is not the first steamboat actually in America. It's simply the first successful one. All the way back in 1787, a guy named John Fitch tried to create his own steamer. Unfortunately, it didn't go so well. In fact, for a long time, steamer boats are not exactly the safest way to travel. They have a potential for blowing up. In fact, in a 10-year span of time between 1820 and 1830, some 237 people will die while traveling on these steamboats. It led to the very first congressional regulation laws. When they started to build these, you had to be inspected by government inspectors and eventually get an official certificate that you were a safe steamboat. But you can see, though, where this is going to revolutionize trade and travel with the invention now of steam-powered boats. You can get to places much quicker than you ever could before. Like I said, this is all considered internal improvements. So once you had steamboats, you had to have a certain way to get them to places. You just couldn't rely on rivers. Rivers only go in the direction that rivers are. So America begins to build canals. And as you see here, this is actually a picture of today's Lake Erie Canal. It's still functioning to this day. This is all, again, part of the transportation revolution. Canals will be built by both public funds, which means government money, and by private businesses. Now, when we say public government, in almost all cases, we're going to say it's built by the states. States will build their own canals. The first and the biggest engineering feat in American history is Lake Erie Canal, also known as Clinton's Big Ditch. DeWitt Clinton is the governor of New York, and he's going to be very instrumental in getting this canal built. They began construction in 1817, and they finished construction in 1825. 364 miles. You're connecting Lake Erie to the Hudson River. This revolutionized everything in America. Now people can go west and still be able to buy goods that they're accustomed to in the East. New York merchants especially were very instrumental in getting this thing built because they want to sell their products out west. And they want to be able to get them there quicker and not have to worry about land transportation. And now that you have steamboats especially, you can get everything quicker. Now this great migration is taking place in America, and more people are starting to head west. So like I said, it's one of the greatest engineering feats of its time period. As this canal and then other canals begin to be built off the Ohio River, the Wabash River, farming communities begin to spring up everywhere. Market towns spring up. Boots and clothes, utensils, agriculture equipment, grain, cattle, hogs, raw material, leather, wool. I think I'm making myself dizzy. I'm talking too fast here. I got to take a few moments here. Breathe. I went really too fast there. Okay. But I think you get the picture. So much money is going to be generated now with trade and creating markets further and further west. And you can get your products to market quicker now because of canal systems, because of the steamboat, and because of the roads that they started building in the 1790s. This is so important for the growth of America. Henry Clay, who we've already talked about in class, and we're not done talking about Henry Clay. He will always use this idea of internal improvements, and he creates what he calls the American system. America. And he's always trying to think nationally. He starts off as what we call a national Republican. Of course, he believes he's in the party of Jefferson. Did somebody say Thomas Jefferson? Oh, I can't believe someone mentioned my name. Yes, Thomas Jefferson. That Thomas Jefferson. The Jefferson of the Republican Party. Henry Clay feels he is an heir to this party, but he starts thinking in more terms of a national party, a national America, by creating all these canals and roads that interconnect communities, that create market towns where you can bring your products to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. You're creating now an America, one nation. Of course, Southern Democratic Republicans like James Monroe, as President of the United States, they don't want that. They think that this is unconstitutional. And again, that's why Monroe will veto in 1822, again, it's the second time I'm saying it, he will veto an improvement bill for the Cumberland Road. But this just opens up the door to so many other things. With canals, eventually these large flat-bottom steamboats start to appear in America. Thousands of them will be all over the Mississippi River, Ohio River, using the canal system to get from one place to another. But very quick now, we're also going to get steam-powered trains. Now look at this thing right here. Is this not a beauty? You can see over here, this train. This looks like I'd like to drive this to school. Could you imagine pulling up in something like this? Nah, I couldn't either. It's ridiculous. But it is. It's an amazing feat that we're going to go literally from horse and carriage to steamboats to trains within just a few decades. This is how fast technology is evolving. 1828. Again, I'll say that date again. 1828. The first railroads begin to appear in America. Now, when they first started, the people that were backing canals, tried to fight this. This is competition, right? And the canals had a monopoly on transportation. You know, if you wanted to get a product from the east to the west or from the west to the east, you had to travel canals. So there were a lot of companies, corporations that were emerging, and they basically had a monopoly on this. But now you have competition with railroads. And at first the canals try to fight it. But the railroads have a major advantage over canals. The railroad can be built almost anywhere. Canals had to be built where rivers were and had to be able to connect to other major rivers. So sometimes they weren't very convenient in the direction that they went. But a railroad, again, can be built almost anywhere. And I find it amazing to think that when Andrew Jackson, we're going to be talking about Andrew Jackson now, when he takes his oath of office for the first time in 1829, that's wrong, 1829. He won the election of 1828. He arrived in Washington, D.C. on a horse-drawn carriage. When he leaves the White House in 1837, he left on a train. So within the 8 years of his presidency, Washington, D.C. grew from just a horse and buggy little podunk little nothing to this now growing metropolis. Washington is starting to become a modern city now. They're going to have trains. Which also then brings me to the last revolution I want to talk about with you guys. The communication revolution. With now trains and canals, with steamboats, being able to bring information quicker, other people began to experiment with other ways of communicating. This is called a semaphore. Semaphores were invented in Europe. There are systems of hydraulics and rods and poles and panels. Here you see on top of a building, here are poles with these rods on it, and each of these are connected, and they can swing around and form various shapes that represent the alphabet. Over here are giant, again, these would be placed on top of buildings. These are panels that are sometimes of various colors. And again, if you can rotate them, and each system of colors would represent various letters in the alphabet. So now you can communicate over long distances. Napoleon Bonaparte is very instrumental in getting this thing done. He wanted to be able to communicate with his military as they were conquering Europe. He also used this for political purposes. So he would know sooner when things were happening. Say you have a building like right here, and this thing, you can see this thing, say, in 10 miles. So then you have another building 10 miles, and then another building 10 miles out, and then another building. So you had a system of semaphores stretched out over hundreds of miles so that you can get information from one end of the country to the other end of the country. But there is a major, major drawback to this. This form of communication is not private at all. If you're giving information as to where your armies are, well, your enemy's going to know as well. Or if you're trying to get some other kind of communication, anyone who could figure out the language can eventually figure out what you're talking about. One of the most famous, though, will now be the telegraph. Samuel B. Morse. Interesting, the form of communication called Morse code, which is named after him, obviously, he didn't name it that. He didn't want to name it that. His partner, his business partner, is what gave it the name of Morse code, the actual form of communication. This is known as a telegraph. Samuel Morse was not a scientist. He actually was a portrait painter. And he painted a lot of famous people's portraits. 1825, he's commissioned by the state of New York $1,000 to paint the portrait of Lafayette, a famous revolutionary hero. He gets a message one day that your dear wife is convalescent. And convalescent means that she was sick, but she's starting to get better. The very next day he gets a message, your wife is dead. I'm sorry to just say it bluntly like that, but that's the message he gets. And this obviously devastates him. He stops the portrait of Lafayette, and he immediately heads home to Connecticut. By the time he gets there, his wife is already buried. This troubled him dearly, and he wanted to know how you can get information quicker to people. Well, going back to New York, he began to find out about experiments in electromagnetism, which eventually led him to Europe. There were several individuals, both in the United States and Europe, working on this very thing. He simply was the first one to get a patent for it. He finally gets federal support. The federal government actually will pay for some of this. In 1842, he strings 2 wires. He's in Washington, D.C., and he strings wires between 2 committee rooms in the Capitol building. And he begins to type out on one end of the telegraph, and it comes out on the other end. People of Congress are very interested. They give him $30,000, and he winds up stringing a wire 38 miles from Baltimore, Maryland to Washington, D.C. On May 1st, 1841, he actually sends out news that the Whig Party, we're going to talk about this new party that's going to be formed, officially nominates Henry Clay for president. But the more famous thing he does is May 24th, 1844, he types out in Morse code, "What hath God wrought?" And the communication revolution now is in full steam ahead, if you pardon the pun there, and telegraph wire will be strung everywhere. He, in many regards, you have to look at Samuel Morse as the grandfather of the computer age. Everything that he does here will lead to the telephone. The telephone will lead to the computer leads to satellites, the satellite leads to your smartphones. So here's a guy that we all need to say thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Morse, because as I sit in Mr. Linhart's class and I'm bored out of my mind, I get to get on my smartphone, look up Facebook, and look up all kinds of things that I want to look up and not have to listen to Mr. Linhart whatsoever. Yay! Yay! I don't really care anymore. All right, so that's really it. You guys are all waiting for this slide presentation. It's only going to go 17 minutes, and that's it. There will be a video log. I'm going to put that up on Edmodo that you will use for this particular video. Okay, see everybody later.